Ever get that feeling like you want to like really get a handle on something kind of complicated, but you don't want to have to wade through like a ton of details?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah, like you just want the good stuff, you know? And that's what we're doing today, right?
Yeah.
This is a deep dive into the UK general election happening on July 4th.
That's right.
And I think this is going to be a good one to get people up to speed so they can be like, you know, genuinely in the know about what's happening across the pond.
That's exactly it. I mean, we've gone through so much information to try and pull out the most important bits for everybody. You know, we've looked at explanations of how the UK political system works, the specifics of this particular election, what the polls are looking like right now, even like the structure of the UK government and courts.
Wow, yeah.
It's a lot, but I think we've got it down to the essentials.
So this is like mission critical information, right?
Yeah. Our mission here is to give everyone a really clear understanding of what's going on, why it matters, you know, all the need to know stuff.
Okay, perfect. So let's jump right in then.
Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first, for anyone tuning in who maybe isn't super familiar with the UK system, can we just like back up for a second and define what exactly a general election is in the UK?
Sure. So basically a general election is a national vote where people all over the UK choose who they want to represent them in Parliament, specifically in the House of Commons.
Okay.
And these representatives are called MPs, members of Parliament.
Gotcha.
And the UK is divided up into 650 of these little areas called constituencies. And each constituency gets to elect one MP to go and represent them in the House of Commons, which is where all the big decisions get made.
Okay, so it's like each community gets to send their own person to be their voice in this big national conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that, what are like the key facts about general elections that everyone needs to know?
All right, so a couple of big things to keep in mind. First, a UK Parliament can only last for a maximum of 5 years. So that means they have to have a general election at least every 5 years to choose a new set of MPs.
Right. It.
And then when an election happens, everyone in each of those 650 constituencies votes for the candidate they want to represent them.
Okay.
And the person who gets the most votes in their constituency wins a seat in the House of Commons.
Okay, so it's not about getting the most votes like overall in the entire country.
Right.
It's about winning your local race.
Right. It's all about winning in your own little area.
Okay, and so then how does that work in terms of forming a government?
So whichever political party wins the most seats across all those 650 constituencies, that's the party that gets to form the government.
Okay.
And the leader of that party becomes the prime minister.
Okay, so that's how they figure out who's in charge.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. And you mentioned Parliament and the House of Commons. Can you just remind me again about the structure there? I know there's the House of Commons and the House of Lords, right?
Exactly. So the UK Parliament actually has two parts. It's bicameral.
Okay.
You've got the House of Commons, which is where all the MPs that are elected by the people go. And then you've got the House of Lords, which is a little different because the members of the House of Lords aren't elected by the public. They're either appointed or they inherit their positions.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. So it's only the House of Commons that's directly elected by the people.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. So we know there's a new election at least every 5 years, but we keep hearing this one called a snap election. What's the deal with that? How often do these actually happen?
So usually it is every 5 years. That's like the general rule.
Right.
But the prime minister actually has the power to decide when to call an election within that 5-year period. It used to be a lot more flexible, and prime ministers could kind of use it to their advantage. But they passed the Fixed Term Parliaments Act in 2011 to try and make things a bit more predictable.
Okay, so that was supposed to stop them from just calling elections whenever they felt like it.
Exactly. It was supposed to make it so they needed Parliament's approval to have an early election.
Oh.
But in this case, Prime Minister Sunak announced back on May 22nd that this would be a snap election. So it's happening sooner than people might have expected.
Interesting. Okay, so can we talk about how a party actually wins a general election? We've been talking about this first past the post system, and it seems like it's all about winning a bunch of these little mini elections across the country.
Yeah, you got it. That's exactly how it works.
Okay, so break it down for me.
Okay, so each of those 650 constituencies only has one MP. When you go to vote, you literally just put an X next to the name of the person you want to win.
Simple enough?
And then after the polls close, they count all the votes in each constituency, and whoever got the most votes in that area wins.
Okay.
They don't have to get more than half the votes, just more than anyone else.
Got it. So it's like 650 separate races all happening at the same time.
Exactly.
And whoever wins the most races wins the whole shebang.
Exactly. And to form a government on their own, they need to win at least 326 of those races. because that gives them a majority in the House of Commons.
Right, 326, that's the magic number.
That's the one.
Okay, so let's zoom in on this election that's happening right now in 2024. What's the overall context that we need to understand?
Well, this election on July 4th is a really big deal. The UK has a population of over 67 million people, and it's the world's 6th largest economy. So the decisions that get made after this election are going to have a big impact.
Yeah, for sure.
And when Prime Minister Sunak called that snap election back in May, it kind of shook things up a bit. It's added a lot of uncertainty, and people are really starting to think that this election could result in some pretty big changes.
Yeah, and the big talk is about a possible change in who's running the show, right?
Yeah, the polls right now are suggesting that the Labour Party might be able to win a majority of the seats, which would mean the Conservative Party would be out of power after 14 years.
Wow, so that would be a huge shift.
It would be massive. And there are probably a lot of different reasons why this might be happening. But one thing that comes up a lot in the data we looked at is how people are feeling about the economy.
Yeah.
And how much things cost.
Right, so there's some dissatisfaction there.
Definitely. It seems like the cost of living is a big issue for people, and that could be pushing them to look for a change.
Interesting. Okay, so we know the date is July 4th, but can we talk about the actual voting process and how we're going to find out who wins?
Yeah, so on July 4th, all the polling stations across the UK will be open from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. local time.
Okay.
And as soon as the polls close at 10 p.m., we're going to start getting those exit polls.
Oh, yeah. Exit polls. Those are always fun.
Yeah. They can be pretty exciting because they give us an early idea of how things might turn out.
Right. They ask people how they voted as they're leaving the polling station.
Exactly. And sometimes they're surprisingly accurate.
Yeah. So after that, it's just a waiting game, right?
Pretty much, we usually start seeing the results from a few constituencies trickle in before midnight. But the vast majority come in during the early hours of the next morning, Friday, July 5th.
Oh, so it's an all-nighter?
It can be, for sure. Just to give you an idea, in the last general election in 2019, it wasn't until about 5 a.m. that the Conservative Party's win was confirmed.
Wow. Okay, so people go to their polling station, they put their X next to their chosen candidate, the votes get counted. We know that 326 seats is a majority. What happens if nobody gets to that number?
That's when we get what's called a hung parliament.
Okay, a hung parliament. What does that mean?
So it means that no single party managed to win those crucial 326 seats that they need to have a majority in the House of Commons.
Okay.
And if that happens, things can get a little messy. There are a couple of things that usually happen. The most common one is that two or more parties have to team up and form what's called a coalition government so they can have enough seats together to have a majority.
Okay, so they have to make some deals?
Exactly. They have to work together. The other possibility is that the party with the most seats, even though it's not a majority, tries to form a minority government. But that can be tough because they have to rely on support from other parties to actually get anything done.
Right, so they're constantly having to negotiate and compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes lead to a lot of instability.
Yeah, hung parliaments definitely sound like they can make things interesting.
Oh, yeah. They can be pretty wild.
Okay, so let's talk about the bigger picture for a second. How is the UK government actually structured? We've talked about Parliament and the Prime Minister, but what's the overall system?
So the UK is a constitutional monarchy,
Okay.
which means that King Charles III is the head of state,
Uh-huh.
but his role is mostly symbolic and ceremonial.
Okay.
One of the things he does is give royal assent to new laws that Parliament passes.
Oh, right. So he has to sign off on this.
Yeah, it's kind of like a final stamp of approval, but it's really just a formality at this point. The real power to make laws rests with Parliament, which, as we've talked about, is made up of two houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords.
Right.
The House of Lords is interesting because as of June 20th, 2024, there are 784 members, and none of them are elected.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
There are life peers who are appointed because of their achievements and hereditary peers who inherit their titles, although there are fewer of them now than there used to be.
Okay.
And then there are also some bishops from the Church of England who get seats in the House of Lords.
Interesting. So the House of Lords is more about reviewing and revising laws that the House of Commons comes up with.
Exactly. They can make suggestions and changes, but they don't really have the power to completely block a law that the House of Commons has passed.
Okay, so the king's the head of state, but Parliament, especially the House of Commons, makes the laws. What about the day-to-day business of running the country?
That's handled by the executive branch of government.
Okay, the executive branch.
Yeah, and they're the ones who put the laws into action and manage all the different parts of the government.
And who's in charge of that?
Well, the big boss is the prime minister.
Right.
And as we know, the prime minister is the leader of whichever party has the majority in the House of Commons.
Uh-huh.
They get officially appointed by the monarch, and they can serve for up to 5 years unless there's an early election.
Okay. And what about the rest of the team?
So the prime minister chooses a bunch of senior ministers to be in the cabinet. And these ministers are usually in charge of different government departments, like the Treasury or the Home Office. And they're the ones who are responsible for specific areas of policy.
Okay, so they've got their own little areas of expertise.
Exactly.
Okay, now we also hear a lot about Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland having their own governments. How does that work?
That's what we call devolution.
Devolution.
Basically, the UK Parliament has handed over some of its powers to the national legislatures in those countries. So, for example, the Scottish Parliament has control over things like education, healthcare, and transportation. The Welsh Parliament, which is called Senedd Cymru,
Sen Cymru, got it.
they handle things like health, education, and local government. And the Northern Ireland Assembly has power over things like health, education, and justice.
Okay, so they have a decent amount of autonomy then.
They do, but it's important to remember that the UK Parliament in Westminster still has ultimate authority.
Right, so they can still step in if they need to.
Exactly. They have the final say.
Okay, that makes
Okay.
sense. So can we take a look at the current parliament right before this election was called? How is the power divided up between the different parties?
Sure. So as of May 30th, 2024, the House of Commons had representatives from 13 different political parties, plus 17 independent MPs.
Wow, so it's a pretty diverse mix.
It is, but the Conservative Party had the biggest share with 344 seats, that's 52.9%, which gave them a majority and control of the government.
Okay.
The Labour Party was the main opposition with 205 seats, or 31.5%. Then you had the Scottish National Party, with 43 seats representing Scotland and pushing for independence. The Liberal Democrats had 15 seats, and then the remaining 43 seats were split between 9 other smaller parties and the independent MPs.
Okay, so a lot of different voices in the mix, but the Conservatives were definitely the dominant force.
For sure, they had a pretty big majority.
Okay. Well, given the polling we talked about earlier, it'll be interesting to see how that balance of power might change after July 4th.
Oh, absolutely. This could be a big shakeup.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what issues are likely to be on voters' minds as they head to the polls. What are people talking about?
Well, based on polling data from around June 24th, the biggest concern for people in the UK is the economy.
Okay, the economy.
Yeah, 52% of the people they polled said it was a major issue for them.
Makes sense. That's usually a big one.
Yeah, healthcare was a close second, with 50% of people saying they were worried about it.
Right.
Immigration and asylum was also a big one for a lot of people, with 40% saying it was a key issue for them. And then after that, you had housing, which was a concern for 24% of people, and the environment, which was a concern for 20%.
Okay, so those are definitely the hot topics that are going to be shaping the debates and influencing how people vote.
For sure. Those are the ones to watch.
Okay, so one last thing before we wrap up. Let's talk about the UK court system. It's independent from the government, right? How does it all work?
Yeah, the judiciary is totally separate from Parliament and the government, and it's really important that it stays that way.
Okay, good to know.
So the top dog in the court system is the Supreme Court,
Okay.
and they're the final court of appeal for everything in the UK, especially when it comes to constitutional issues or big public policy questions. Below that, you have the Court of Appeal, which has a civil division and a criminal division,
Okay.
and they hear appeals from the lower courts. And then you've got the High Court, which deals with more serious cases. And it's divided into 3 parts. The King's Bench Division, which handles civil disputes and some criminal cases. The Chancery Division, which deals with business property and trust law. And the Family Division, which handles things like divorce and child custody.
Wow, so that's a lot of different types of cases.
It is. It's a big system.
And what about the courts below the High Court?
Okay, so for criminal cases, you have the Crown Court, which handles the really serious offenses like murder, rape, robbery, things like that, and they can give out life sentences.
Okay.
Then for less serious civil cases, you've got the County Court, which handles things like personal injury claims, debt recovery, and housing disputes. And at the very bottom of the ladder, you have the Magistrates Court, which deals with minor offenses and also does the initial hearings for more serious cases before they get sent up to the higher courts.
So it's a whole hierarchy designed to make sure that cases are handled fairly.
Exactly. And to give people a chance to appeal if they think something wasn't done right.
Okay, well, I think we covered a lot of ground today.
We did.
We've learned about the upcoming UK general election on July 4th. We talked about the first past the post voting system. We got into the roles of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. We looked at the current political landscape with the Conservative Party in the lead, but potentially facing a challenge from Labour. And we discussed the key issues that are on voters' minds, like the economy and healthcare.
And we even squeezed in an overview of how the UK government and the courts work.
We did. It was a whirlwind, but hopefully people feel like they have a much better understanding of what's going on.
That's the goal.
And now that we've laid all that out, here's a final question for everyone listening.
Okay, hit us.
Given this snap election and the possibility of a power shift, how do you think the UK's domestic and international policies might be affected in the long run? Regardless of who wins, how might the relationship between the economy, the healthcare system, and the UK's place in the world change over the next few years? Think about it. It's a big question with no easy answers.
It really is. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.